Right. This morning's keynote, the future of competition intervention in markets, and we are very happy to have Dr. Howard Shelanski, Professor of Law at Georgetown University and partner Davis Polk & Wardwell. An abridged version of his greatest hits includes Administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs under the Obama administration, Director of the Bureau of Economics at the FTC, Chief Economist of the Federal Communications Commission, Senior Economist to the President's Council of Economic Advisers, Law Clerk to the late Justice Antonin Scalia at the US Supreme Court. His main hobby is ultra-marathon trail running in his spare time, of which there cannot be very much, and he enjoys dark police novels and jazz, and like me, and I was pretty excited about this, he enjoys, or rather endures, watching the Arsenal football team, although he probably calls it a soccer team. Do you call it a soccer team, Howard?
When we're home, yes.
Yeah, well, we'll differ on that. It's football. The discussant, and it was pointed out to me that I did not mention this prior to the break, what a feature this is, Dr. James Every Palmer QC, Barrister Street Chambers. We met James yesterday, of course. We're getting almost as much value out of him as we did with Sarah Court. Over to you.
Thank you, Gordon, and I really want to thank the Commission, particularly the former Chair Mark Berry and Katie Rusbatch, who a year and a half ago invited me to come give this speech, and it's really always a pleasure to be here in Auckland and to interact with so many people with so many interesting ideas. In fact, the problem of having a keynote on the second day is that so much interesting stuff has come up that all I want to do now is talk about what's been talked about in the last panels and to respond to it. But I will stick to my theme. Before I begin, a disclosure. In my private practice life, I do represent a large digital platform company, Facebook, namely. And so with that disclosure, you can appropriately choose to evaluate my remarks through that filter. I will say that they have neither seen nor approved, nor might not very much like the speech I'm about to give, in which case I may be full-time back at Georgetown sooner than I think. So regulation and antitrust enforcement can be alternative or complementary ways to promote competition. I think that's a theme that we've been hearing through some of the earlier panels already in this conference. In broad strokes, I think it is fair to say that over the past 30 years or so, most industrialized economies have turned away from governing economic conduct through ex-ante rules and toward governing economic activities through ex-post standards of competition law. The OECD reports that in 1990, there were only 16 countries with independent competition authorities. Today, that number is more than 120. Over the same period, many jurisdictions have moved away from regulation in key economic sectors, ranging from airlines and financial services to telecoms and energy. If it is too much to say that regulation had developed a bad name, policymakers had at least become acutely aware of the difficulty, cost, and unintended consequences that regulation could entail. The less prescriptive case-by-case approach of competition enforcement, with its well-developed economic toolkit and greater reliance on market forces to govern economic performance, offered an attractive alternative even for some concentrated markets or dominant firms. New Zealand, in fact, was ahead of the curve in this shift towards generic competition law. The Rogernomics of the 1980s removed state ownership, price controls, export monopolies, and other forms of prescriptive regulation earlier and faster than in most comparable countries. Even with the recent movement back toward regulating utilities, today's framework remains much more light-handed than it was 35 years ago. While I think the increased reliance on competition enforcement has generally been welcome, I also think antitrust alone cannot address all competitive problems. A few markets might remain true natural monopolies. In other markets, consumer welfare might depend on diversity of control as much as on variety and price of products. And in yet other lines of business, critical inputs or gateways to consumers might be durably controlled by a single firm. It is a good thing, then, that numerous commissions, and commentators are asking whether regulatory complements or alternatives to antitrust enforcement could improve competition, innovation, and overall economic performance in certain markets. The key is to remain mindful of the lessons learned from regulatory efforts of the past. As digital platforms attract concern about their centralized power over key areas of consumers' lives, perceived durability of their market share, and their potential control over market access by rivals, much policy debate has centered on how to use antitrust tools and remedies, like divestiture, to make digital markets more responsive to consumers. There are good reasons that bluntly breaking up the big tech platforms, while perhaps a resonant campaign slogan or a superficially tempting prescription, would in fact be very hard to accomplish, harmful to consumers, and of doubtful value to competition. With that hit job done, I will now move on. Other commentators and agencies, however, have made thoughtful arguments about the role that a regulatory authority might play in crafting alternative and more effective ways to bring competition to digital marketplaces. The conditions under which digital platforms might cause harm and what remedies such harms might warrant suggest good reasons to bring regulation back into the policy discussion and to ask what forms of regulation might help to ensure competitive discipline in markets where giants of perhaps varying gentleness might roam. Traditionally, government officials used antitrust and regulation to address somewhat distinct problems. Antitrust was the mechanism for mostly ex post inquiry into conduct that, with the notable exception of cartel behavior, is potentially but not presumptively harmful to competition. Regulation, in contrast, was the mechanism for mostly ex ante prescriptions, government or prohibitions on conduct that, if allowed to proceed unfettered, government could presume to harm competition and consumers. Examples of the former might include inquiry into exclusive dealing, cooperative purchasing, and product bundling. Examples of the latter include rate tariffs, line of business restrictions, and interconnection obligations for a monopoly. I think it a fair statement that the balance of sentiment in market economies has been that ex post antitrust enforcement has net advantages over prescriptive regulation. In the words of now Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer, the problems that plagued regulation include high cost, ineffectiveness and waste, procedural unfairness, complexity and delay, unresponsiveness to democratic control, and the inherent unpredictability of the end result, end quote. To that list, others have added things like entrenchment and regulatory capture. Antitrust, in contrast, had come to be seen in that classical regulatory framework as relatively free of such pathologies. In a 1987 article, Justice Breyer described this view as holding that, quote, antitrust is not another form of regulation, antitrust is an alternative to regulation, and where feasible, a better alternative. Alfred Kahn, architect of U.S. airline deregulation, concurred. The antitrust laws are not just another form of regulation, but an alternative to it, indeed its very opposite. However, as many commentators, including Breyer and Kahn, have observed, regulation is not always inferior to or mutually exclusive of antitrust. Regulation might be the only short-run policy option available to officials if they wish to tackle a problem that antitrust law cannot reach or is not well suited to solve. For example, once a monopoly is in place, antitrust is better suited to preventing the monopolist from anti-competitively impeding entry or expanding into other markets than to limiting the monopolist's power or to introducing new competition. Because competition policy typically does not punish bigness or market share in itself, it relies on market forces to attract entry and eventually erode monopoly power. Only in the rarest of cases has antitrust law broken up a monopoly, and then because that monopoly achieved or maintained its power illegally. Regulation is therefore the available means for controlling the exercise of quote-unquote justly gained monopoly power if policymakers choose to take any action at all. And that is a big if. But interestingly, a regulatory process for competition enforcement may provide a very different criterion for action than antitrust, and indeed may provide a different framework through which policymakers can think about whether to take action. Certainly in the US jurisdiction, and I think in some others, a competition agency is ultimately beholden to prove its case in court, to prove that harm is more likely than not, to carry the burden of showing that there is going to be an anti-competitive outcome from a particular merger or a particular course of conduct. Regulation is a more administrative process that tends to look through a somewhat different lens, not the lens of harm being more probable than not, but more of a balance of harms or a risk and uncertainty approach, where even harms that might not be terribly probable, but would be very large if they did occur, might be prevented. You might take action on an expected value basis against unlikely harms, but quite catastrophic or at least quite large harms. The balance of harms approach for regulation actually could be quite well suited to some of the harms that people are talking about in marketplaces today. Harms where an agency, an antitrust agency, trying to plead its case in court, might have trouble showing that the harm is more likely than not, and might get rather little credit for taking action, even if that harm, if it were to occur, would be very large. And this tends to be a problem in a number of merger cases. If we think about the AT&T Time Warner vertical merger case in the US, and we'll talk about that on a later panel, that's a case where the government failed to prove that harm was more likely than not. But the harms that could have occurred were really quite large. There was never a point in the trial where the court asked, what would the magnitude of harms be? So that I can multiply the probability of harm times the magnitude of harm and decide whether we have a reasonable action here on the part of the government. That is very much the framework of competition policy, not expected value, but more likely than not that the event will occur. One advantage of regulation in markets that are susceptible, for example, to tipping, where the monopoly could be large and complete and enduring, might be to say the likelihood of tipping as a result of a particular action might actually not be that high. The consequences of tipping, on the other hand, could be enormous. And you can use that regulatory balance of harms approach to perhaps get at competitive harms in a better way than typical antitrust law approaches of sort of the US type would allow you to do. This is an approach that was suggested in what has come to be called the Furman Report out of the UK. Jason Furman has given a lot of thought to the balance of harms approach. It's one that's very difficult to sell in a competition law framework, in an antitrust framework, but that might get much easier traction in the administrative structure of a regulatory agency. So just another reason that we might think that regulatory agencies have something to bring to bear in monopoly or potentially monopoly markets. Whether or not regulators should take action against the monopolists will likely then depend on two things: whether the monopoly satisfies conditions of economic harm, durability, and remediability, and second, whether available regulatory mechanisms are likely to remedy the monopoly's harms without creating equally harmful side effects for consumers. Indeed, where regulation might not fully remedy harm, allowing market forces to drive entry and innovation could yield higher net benefits over time. However, when monopoly harms will not be remediable ex post and where monopoly power is durable, the cost-benefit calculation shifts in the direction of regulatory intervention. The case for intervention then depends not on the nature of the harm, but on the efficacy of available regulatory tools. And in this regard, not all regulatory mechanisms are equal. Indeed, they differ in many ways, but three criteria might be particularly useful, comparative dimensions, when considering the use of regulation to enforce competition. And the three that I at least would like to focus on right now are whether the regulation fills a gap in competition policy or antitrust enforcement, that is to say, do something that competition law cannot, the administrability or practical implementability, if that's a word, of the regulatory program, and finally, consistency with the pro-competitive principles of antitrust policy. There's a lot of regulation that depends on limiting competition to create competition, and the more that you do that, the more I think you become inconsistent with the principles of antitrust or competition policy, the more consistent regulation can be, I think the better a complement or a substitute for antitrust enforcement it can be. We can use the above criteria to compare three principal ways that regulation can cabin monopoly power and introduce competition: price controls, line of business restrictions, and access to or interconnection with the monopolist's key facilities. From the start, price regulation does something that antitrust does not. Putting aside efforts in some jurisdictions to develop a generally applicable approach to, quote, excessive pricing, unquote, antitrust law does not stop monopolists from enjoying the returns from market power that is the result in the memorable formulation of the famous Alcoa case in the US of superior skill, foresight, and industry. However, if price regulations check the antitrust gap filler box, that is doing something that antitrust law generally does not, it fares much less well by other criteria. The pathologies of price regulation are well known, and I won't recount them here. I think more importantly is the fact that price regulation to some extent represents an abandonment of hope of competition in the regulated sector. While there might be good reasons for such abandonment under particular conditions, it should be recognized that price regulation is in many ways antithetical to the introduction of competition in the monopoly sector. Consistent with this observation, I would note that in Part 4 of New Zealand's Commerce Act, it provides for information disclosure and price control regulation in markets where, quote, there is little or no competition and little or no likelihood of a substantial increase in competition. Price regulation can entrench a monopoly. It can deter entry. For all of those reasons, one really should have good reason to think there is unlikely to be market competition, at least in any reasonable time frame. Another way that regulators try to fence in monopoly is through line of business restrictions. And I know that there will be a panel at 3 o'clock today that talks about line of business restrictions. These are restrictions that are designed typically to prevent an enterprise from potentially leveraging its market power into new markets. Regulators have used this approach in several industries. US banking and telecommunications are notable examples. And I understand that in New Zealand, Chorus is subject to line of business restrictions on retail telecoms, and that electricity distribution businesses are restricted in terms of their involvement in generating and selling electricity. More recently, some have proposed the approach of line of business restrictions to curb the power of digital platforms, notably Amazon, which is in a particularly strong position to compete with and therefore have incentive to discriminate against a large segment of its own customers, notably the retailers who sell online through Amazon. Line of business restrictions have the advantage of creating structural separation between a monopolist and a potentially competitive market for complements or inputs. There are, however, several problems with line of business restrictions. One is that the line between the monopoly service and complements is not always crisp. The monopolist might innovate in ways that add capabilities to its core product or service, some of which might begin to cross the line into forbidden territory. Not only is policing that line burdensome, but policing it too strictly would limit the development of the monopoly service and could therefore harm consumers. A second related problem in determining what constitutes entry or participation by the monopolist in the prohibited line of business. If such arrangements could lead to joint investments or tailoring of technology that make the monopolist product and the complementary product better work together, disallowing all such cooperation between the monopolist and firms in the prohibited lines of business might not benefit consumers. Regulators must therefore choose between a hardline rule with some inevitable costs from foregone product improvement or incurring the increased cost of an administrative process for granting exceptions. Such administrative processes can become unwieldy. From 1984 through 1986, a single US district court ruled on more than 900 petitions for waivers from the AT&T consent decree's line of business restrictions. The third problem with line of business restrictions is that they are in tension with core principles of competition policy. As a general matter, competition policy favors entry into new markets by any firm, even if that firm is large or dominant in a different market. Competition enforcers typically address any unwanted spillovers of market power through enforcement against tying, bundling, predatory pricing, and other mechanisms of anti-competitive conduct. To be sure, such enforcement is imperfect, and there are legal doctrines in place in many jurisdictions, particularly in my home jurisdiction, that make such enforcement difficult. But I think it a fair generalization that competition policy to date, I think rightfully, prefers entry with the risk of spillover effects to entry prohibitions that reduce competition altogether. For this reason, if regulators use line of business restrictions at all, they should do so only where the benefits of the monopoly's entry are small, the competitive risks from such entry are very high, and gains from coordination between the monopoly and complementary products are likely to be small compared to the expected costs of anti-competitive discrimination. The final type of regulation I wish to address today is mandatory access or interconnection to an incumbent's products or facilities. The two main benefits of such access regulations are to allow markets vertically related to the monopoly facility to be competitive and to enable potential competitors to the monopoly itself to gain access to inputs, customers, and network effects from which the monopolists might otherwise block them. An example of the first type of benefit is the connection of competing electricity generators to the monopoly grid, competition in a complementary or vertically related market. An example of the second is interconnection of competing local exchange or internet service providers to an incumbent local telecommunications network, competition with the incumbent service itself. The relationship of access regulation to established competition law doctrines is partly one of redundancy and partly one of complementary gap filler. As to redundancy, there are a number of antitrust doctrines across jurisdictions that limit foreclosure and discrimination against rivals. And there is some limited recourse, with variations depending on jurisdiction, to sue a monopolist for its refusal to deal under the antitrust laws. There is, however, not just in US antitrust law, but looking at a number of major jurisdictions, no robust essential facilities doctrine, and mandated duties to deal are strongly disfavored under all but the most unusual of circumstances. For this reason, in the European Union, the US, as well as New Zealand, when meaningful access and interconnection has been required, the vehicle for such mandates has been sector-specific regulation, not general competition law. New Zealand examples include the Telecommunications Act and customer switching rules in the electricity industry. Interconnection regulation, therefore, can be a supplement to antitrust law in providing competitors with broader, more automatic access to monopoly facilities that cannot practically be replicated or worked around. This access could lead to competition at various market levels. A requirement that a monopoly platform or network have relatively open application programming interfaces, or APIs, enables more robust competition among providers of vertically related complementary products. To the extent interoperability of such complements gives a smaller firm access to the platform's large network of users, it could also reduce barriers to eventual competition directly with the platform itself. Interconnection can, at least in theory, provide a variety of players, from established complementers to nascent rivals at any level, an on-ramp to the user base they need to compete and expand into adjacent markets, even the market of the platform itself. To the extent antitrust law in a given jurisdiction does not itself provide such an on-ramp, regulation is a potential gap filler. With respect to implementation, however, access rules immediately raise two questions for regulators. To what extent should rivals have access, or to what exactly should rivals have access, and on what terms and condition? These questions plagued the access rules for local telecommunications competition in the United States, as well as in a number of other jurisdictions, with protracted battles over the list of unbundled network elements and over the pricing model that would be used for such access. Those problems did not, however, prove intractable. And the more identifiable the essential facility is, and the closer the marginal cost of access is to zero, the more easily regulators can avoid some of the costs of implementing access rules. One key thing to investigate further is exactly what parts of the current digital platforms should be accessible through APIs, and on what terms. I think the pricing question might be quite easy. as there is a very good case that the price should be zero. As to the scope of access, that will undoubtedly be the subject of considerable debate. However, there is no reason to think it harder to identify the essential facilities through a regulatory process than through a case-by-case antitrust enforcement process. In fact, it might be easier. It might be more efficient as well to resolve these questions through an industry-wide regulatory proceeding than through piecemeal antitrust proceeding, or, heaven help us, a legislative proceeding. Maybe you're better off here in New Zealand than we are in the States, but it's sort of a hopeless case in the US, at least right now, with a divided Congress. This leaves the question of consistency with competition law objectives and principles. As already discussed, price regulation usually kicks in where the hope for competition has, for at least a time, been abandoned. Line of business restrictions take the risky approach of blocking some competitors to protect others, a risky trade-off that is antithetical to the principle of promoting entry and organic expansion fairly played, even by a large firm or one that is dominant in another sector. Access rules, in contrast, do not prevent the underlying network or platform from competing on the merits in any market. Access regulation simply says that firms on the periphery get access to incumbent facilities without which they would have no hope of prospering. Access rules introduce competition on a network without muffling the network itself. One might object that access rules can expropriate the investment of the underlying platform and enable free riding by rivals that will dampen future investment and innovation incentives, and even facilitate collusion. I think these can be serious issues under some conditions, but where rules mandate access to things, and this is important, that did not principally result from a platform's technological investments or assumptions of capital risk, the free riding and incentive concerns are mitigated, as is the need to have a pricing term. So with access to a base of users, or to basic data that the users themselves provide to a network, the expropriation is hard to see. Sharing a critical user-provided input or demand-side network externality might indeed be inconvenient for the platform and erode barriers to entry, but that is the point. It is why access rules help achieve the goals of competition policy. Regulators should be cautious, though. Even with access rules that target customer-provided inputs and network effects, it is possible for regulation to go too far. The line between data and derived information, for example, is important because the latter can be the result of the platform's skill and innovation. Sharing the latter can damage incentives on all sides, and the competitive justification for such sharing of derived information is weak. Mandating access to algorithms, as opposed to the raw inputs needed to train such algorithms, would raise similar concerns. Finally, network integrity is an important concern, especially for large digital platforms. Although damaging the network can be a pretext for blocking access to APIs, it is not always so, and too cavalier an approach by regulators to access could lead to a different set of problems for consumers. Another objection one might make, and that the late Justice Scalia did make in the US Supreme Court's 2004 Trinco decision, is that access rules might promote exactly the opposite of what the antitrust laws promote, i.e. such rules might promote cooperation rather than competition among rivals. With respect to my late boss, I think this concern might arise in a concentrated market where there are relatively few potential rivals. An example that might support the concern is that of collusive pay-for-delay or authorized generic settlements in pharmaceutical markets. However, where rivals are numerous, the range of services and markets are fragmented, and the stakes harder to divide, conditions that I think hold to varying degrees for large digital platforms, I think the collusion concern is greatly, if not entirely, diminished, and access rules do not create a material tension with antitrust principles and objectives. There are many aspects of bringing regulation into competition policy that I could not address today: institutional comparisons, additional forms of regulation, and some deeper economic considerations of platform conduct and potential remedies, to name just a few. But my purpose here has been to add to those voices that have suggested bringing regulatory mechanisms back into the discussion of policy towards large and important enterprises whose dominance is potentially durable. I've tried to advance that discussion by explaining some criteria by which alternative regulatory mechanisms might be evaluated, and why access regulation, with its emphasis on interconnection and interoperability, might be a particularly useful complement to antitrust enforcement in markets of central policy concern today. Again, I'm very grateful to have been invited to be here with you today, and thank you very much for your attention.
Yesterday, a number of speakers made the case that it had been established that there was a good basis for thinking about industry-specific regulation for digital platforms. At least one speaker went even further to somewhat grandly and vaguely suggest that New Zealand should have its own technology commission with some sort of regulatory mandate. So I think it's extremely valuable, Howard, to have your insights and frameworks to think more carefully about the different forms that regulation could take and what types of regulation might be best suited for digital platforms. What I want to do is make 3 comments in that general area and then invite you to make a response to that, and after that we'll throw it open to the floor because I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. So access regulation in your framework, I think, was perhaps the most potentially promising form of regulation that you looked at. And one form of access regulation are rules around switching. So the creation of a process where a user can say, I want to move from one platform to another, and a streamlined form of information sharing to allow data, some forms of data at least, to go across to the new platform. Now, New Zealand's experience of switching rules have typically been in mature industries where there is a common language and common standards, and that may not be the case in relation to digital platforms, whereas in telecommunications or electricity, if a customer's switching across, the sort of information that has to go across is not really an issue in dispute, whereas if someone's leaving Facebook or Uber, there seems to be much more room for contention. Similarly, in the New Zealand experience where we've developed those rules, at least in electricity and banking, it's occurred where there are not just a single monopolist, but a number of players. So while they may benefit from the absence of a switching regime, at least there's a potential upside if you've got a switching regime, because you might be losing some customers, but you've at least got the potential for others to be switching across to you. So one issue there, and I'll go through all 3 of my comments first before I hand it back over to you, but is whether those features make a difference. Does it matter that we're dealing with very large incumbents rather than a group of players in an industry, and does it matter that we don't yet have a common language and common standards and a clear understanding of what switching would involve? And related to that is the distinction that you've drawn, Howard, between I guess raw data from the user and derived data, which has been in a sense created by the platform or through interactions on the platform. And so an example of that might be if a rival to Uber wants to be able to transfer a customer across, as well as their personal details. They'd quite like their ride history, but also their star rating. Now, do you all know your Uber star ratings? Hands up if you know what your number is. Keep it up if you know it to 2 decimal places. Anyone better than 4.2? It's pretty hard, isn't it? Yeah, you know, quite a few. Oh, that's interesting. So I'll do a trade with someone, I think. So that star rating is not data that unfortunately it's not data that you've provided to the site. It's data that's been generated through interactions on the site and from the feedback of drivers in the case of passengers and passengers in the case of drivers. Now, the question there is, does that cut across into the second category of data that's been derived, or is it raw data? Because it seems to have features of both. There doesn't seem to be a particularly large technological investment that's gone into creating that number, albeit it's not something that's been directly provided by the user. You happy to wait to the end before responding, Howard?
I'm happy to wait,
okay.
Unless you want me to jump in.
No, I'll go through them. So you cautioned against price regulation, appropriately cautioned against price regulation in industries where there's the potential for competition. But it seems that another potential complexity, if you did get over that hurdle and wanted to think about price regulation in relation to platforms, is that typically for at least one side of the market, the price is already zero. So if you see how we apply price regulation in New Zealand, where there's a well-established methodology, the building blocks methodology of working out a maximum allowable revenue that a regulated entity can earn over a period of time such that its net present value return on its investments is zero. Well, how can you even think about that applying when you've already got a price equal to zero? And I guess to put out there, just to get your response in terms of the framework and feasibility of thinking of these issues in terms of a platform, is that perhaps rather than a monopoly price, what we see with platforms are quality effects in terms of being shown excessive advertisements, more than would be the optimal competitive level. Perhaps where our attention is being overtaxed, that the level of addictiveness is higher than you'd expect in a competitive market, or perhaps there's too much data being collected at too low a level of transparency. So those are potential monopoly profiteering through not a high price, but through negative quality impacts. On the price side, though, I guess one way you can think about it is that perhaps the equilibrium market price, if there was competition, more competition across these markets, wouldn't be a zero price, but would be a negative price. Perhaps we would be being paid for our time, attention, and data rather than getting these services for free, in which case monopoly regulation of the price could actually be quite attractive, that we start getting paid for our surfing behaviour. Then the third issue I wanted to put out there, and this has been touched on in the panel on privacy and competition and consumer regulation yesterday, is the idea that we're really dealing with far more than typical economic regulatory issues. So to this audience, when we say regulation, people would normally understand economic regulation, and they would normally understand that to mean either facilitating competition or imposing a regulatory framework which attempts to replicate competitive outcomes. But platforms seem to give rise to a far wider range of issues across privacy, algorithmic decision-making, fake news, impact on elections, unreasonable persuasion. That's the idea that perhaps you'll get targeted by an advertisement when you're at your most vulnerable. So if the system learns when to push an advertisement for salt and vinegar chips to you on a Saturday evening, or when it learns to push an advertisement for gym membership on a Sunday morning, does it reach a limit where that becomes an unreasonable form of persuasion? Price discrimination, which obviously there's an economic efficiency rationale, but it still feels wrong when if Uber were to use my data against me, and issues of addiction and social harms from social media. So I think the issue there is that when you're dealing with a myriad of issues like that, can we carve off economic regulation as a separate issue, or should we be trying to address the myriad of issues all in one go? So back to you.
Well, thanks so much, James. Great questions. Let me start just very quickly on the data portability. By the way, one word of advice: don't give your teenagers your Uber account. Your rating will go down. They tend to discover beer and mobility at around the same age. Terrible mix. Took me a few years to recover after my son was a teenager. But I'm up to a 4.87. I do know to 2 decimals. But I do think that something like a star rating is a very interesting example. That's something that is not hard to get, in the sense that if consumers can take their data elsewhere, that's something that they can easily see. It's transparent to them, and they can take that with them. So I do think the consumer data portability is an extremely important thing. And you could imagine a coupon that would go from one rideshare company to buy that data from you. $10 off your first ride, or a $10 credit if you switch to us and use $50 of rides in the next 3 weeks or something like that. And you can bring, and you'd fill out what your data is, how often do you ride, what's your star rating on that other site. So I think we need to think about what data really has to be part of a regulated portability regime. There's an awful lot of data out there. Professor Catherine Tucker from MIT has written, I think, very persuasively about this. So we don't want to go ahead and regulate data that an individual really has access to. It's really the question of, do we need to regulate access to masses of data in one place? So all the users' star ratings, for example, or all the users' contact information or things like this. And this is where data portability or access to data can run into privacy regulations, into various things like that. But I think if a consumer can, I do think it's important that a consumer's own data and their own profile be in a fairly rich way portable. And I think that way there is at least an opportunity to win over the consumer and say, you don't have to recreate that whole record, you bring it with you. And we learn a bunch of stuff that allows us to match you efficiently with drivers in this case, or to serve you efficiently. So I think consumer data portability is important. I do think when you start to get into algorithms or the things that really extract a lot of rich information, maybe the very same thing that would allow Google to know that on a Saturday night I am in fact in my local pub. I do in fact want salt and vinegar chips. They don't even have to remind me. But they know these things about me, and whether that's a good or bad thing is I think a separate question. I'll get to that. But should those inferred things that they get through data science and the mining of so-called big data have to be shared? My answer tends to be no. I think there's a difference between the raw data that consumers provide and the information that the big platforms extract from it. There may be other problems with that big data, but to me, as a competitive matter, that's not something I would be in favor of seeing shared. As to your point about zero prices and how you even think about price regulation. So you noted the Stigler report's sort of argument that zero price is a price. The equilibrium price, the competitive equilibrium price, might in fact be negative. Maybe you should be paying people for your data. And just for ease of implementability and the difficulty of doing micropayments, platforms round the price up to zero, and consumers don't really care. I do think that we have to then think about things outside of typical prices, and I think that has driven a lot of the emphasis on privacy policies, on quality, on things like that. And what you would hope to see, if data does have a value and zero is in fact a high price for consumers, is very easy ways for consumers to change their privacy settings, to change their defaults, to have more advantageous defaults. Not to have to, I think as Delia explained, go through 5 or 7 different screens to get to turn off your location setting in a particular app. I think that's the way we would look to see people compensated for the value of that data, and that's where competition can be really valuable, because it will be the ease of the menu, the ease of interacting, the ability to control what's done with that data and the way it's used towards you, that will be the way that you are compensated for what you give. And I think to me that's a lot of the argument of trying to create more competition in these markets. In terms of the regulations that I have looked at, and I didn't, for example, look at things like a ban on acquisitions as a form of regulation, something I wouldn't favor, because I don't like line of business restrictions, and I view that as a variant on line of business restrictions. But certainly there are whole areas of regulation that are unrelated to competition, and I didn't address those. They might involve things that are affected by competition, that would vary with competition, but I think more are questions of size and how these big, powerful networks are used. It is very possible that certain things that happen as a result of these platforms are bad things. It could well be, for example, that the addiction to Amazon Prime and always getting that great deal is killing Main Street in your hometown and creating a number of pathologies that might come along with that. There are no more local jobs at that sort of retail level, that entry level. Now you've got to go to an Amazon warehouse or whatever it is to work. these are social disruptions of a very profound kind that I do think may be far more important, I hate to admit this, than all the competition issues that we're thinking about. You know, there are, I think, serious social issues. There are serious issues of the way people interact, the way students learn, the way people's minds get wired that we're only beginning to learn about. And those, to me, are public health regulation, employment regulation, all kinds of things that I think should be kept outside of the competition law purview. We can't solve those with competition law. If we try to, we will have competition regulators making decisions about areas in which they are manifestly inexpert. And importantly, I think making trade-offs amongst the welfare of different groups of people. That should be done at a more democratic or more accountable level. And I think for that reason, there's sort of a different kind of expertise. So I don't mean at all to say the regulations related to competition should be the be-all and end-all of how we think about the effects of various kinds of industries. We need environmental regulation, health and safety regulation, employment regulation, and I think those are things that we're only beginning to learn about and appreciate at this point.
Do you think that those things can be carved off from economic regulation? Is it sensible to separate them out, or is it sensible to think of it collectively?
Well, I think one has to. It's a good question. I think when one thinks about platforms, one needs to say, or any kind of marketplace. Let's think about the automobiles that we all love to drive, or that most of us love to drive. I mean, these things are doing terrible things, and affecting our environment. And when we think about the automobile industry, we should think not just about competition in automobiles. We should think not just about credit fraud and things like that when it comes to automobiles. We should think more holistically about environmental effects, and we should be aware that there is a broader set of regulations that are at issue. But I then think that those need to be thought about somewhat independently. The cost-benefit trade-offs of tailpipe emissions are going to be, very different from, and not necessarily affect how competition works. Although there's a relationship, it may raise prices for a while for vehicles to the extent that, you've got manufacturers that need to recover the R&D costs of developing those lower tailpipe emissions. So I think, I do think that we can sort of step back and realize that we should realize regulation is broader than competition regulation, but I don't think we need to think about it in a general equilibrium model. I think we can think about them separately. As long as we don't forget to think about them, we should think about all these areas of regulation.
Well, I think we'll throw it over to Gordon to throw it across to everyone else, but I should say I just did check my Uber rating, and surprisingly 4.85, so I'm only 0.02 less nice than you, Howard.
That's
which
because
surprises
I
me.
let my wife use my account, and she raises the rating.
Yeah. Well, I have the opposite effect with my kid to you with yours. My 7-year-old is very charming, so since I've started dropping him off at the ferry to go to school in the mornings, my rating's gone up hugely.
There you go. Okay.
I was going to say you're not giving him access to the app on his own. All right. Right, questions. We have a question right at the back here. Is that Ruben?
Yes, it is. Thank you, Gordon.
How's the device going there, Ruben?
It's pretty good. Thanks for that. 4.91 was the rating, actually. So
Oh.
did know that in previous workplaces.
He must have 2 cute kids.
I had a question about the idea of access to, say, a dominant platform that allows third-party apps to join that platform and take advantage of any of the network effects or access to data so that they're not blocked or excluded from creating some form of competition. And you talk about how that could allow these other apps to maybe even in time develop to a point where they compete against the platform itself. I guess that's predicated on them not being acquired by the dominant platform, which then raises the question around merger and acquisition law and to what extent that you would need, or does that law need to change perhaps to take on some of that expected harm approach that you talk about the regulation in and of itself. And in that, from memory, I think the ACCC preliminary digital platform report suggested...
Ruben, the question? What is your question, Ruben?
So do you have a view on that?
Sure.
Does merger law need to change?
Thank you.
Sure. Thanks very much. So I do think that I have long thought that merger law quite apart from any platform debate, has certain deficiencies. And I think that it does a very poor job of dealing with innovation and dealing with nascent competition. So I do think, as a point that was well made by, I think, Marina yesterday, that the potential competition doctrine in the US, at least, has been moribund. And I think, to be sure, some of the economics surrounding how you take innovation into account and how you deal with potential competition are very difficult to get a handle on. But I would say that the Furman report does a very nice job of talking about ways in which one might need to make potential competition doctrine more vibrant. I do think in the United States, we're seeing the antitrust agencies already start to take a very hard line on acquisitions, particularly in pharma and biotech, of pipeline products. And if you want to do that merger, you have to divest the marketed product, and then you have all the incentive to develop the pipeline product. So I do think there are changes afoot. I think these are healthy changes. That said, I want to caution against there's this very fine paper out there on quote-unquote killer acquisitions. Very nice empirical paper. There's some good economics been done on that. The problem with a catchy title like killer acquisitions is it becomes a thing in policy. And suddenly people say, we have to stop killer acquisitions. Well, we have to avoid space aliens and malicious ghosts as well. These things tend to be rather rare. So I think that I would be very cautious about anything approaching a ban on acquisitions by even a large digital platform. It is true that these platforms could squelch a potential future rival, but I think more often than not, if you actually look at the acquisitions these companies are undertaking, at the time those acquisitions are done, there was nothing that even looked feasible about this company becoming a future rival. Their input, their partial pieces of technology, their acqui-hires, they're fragile companies that have an idea that could be valuable in conjunction with the platform. And very importantly, a lot of innovation investment happens because there was this large demand out there by the digital platforms, and one should be rather cautious, I think, of killing that off. So I really don't like the idea of an acquisition ban, but I do like the idea of a more rigorous approach to potential competition, and importantly, one that is less worried about over-enforcement and more worried about under-enforcement. So we might block a few more of these transactions, but we should still have a good reason for doing so, not just because we like the quip of killer acquisition.
I just add 2 comments to that. Firstly, I think that it's quite easy to inflate your Uber rating when you're leaving your wallet behind in the back of the taxi each time, Ruben. Secondly, in thinking about the problem with an acquisition where there's a high impact, low probability that the potential target is going to turn into a big competitor in the future, I think in New Zealand, the framework that we've got where you can have more than one likely counterfactual helps with that analysis to a certain extent, because it's not the way you were describing it, Howard, in the States, where unless you can reach a more likely than not threshold, the possibility is discounted. Our courts have accepted that you've got to look at likely counterfactuals, but more than one thing can be likely. Okay. But I think where we don't have a sufficiently sophisticated framework is that things that are don't pass that likely framework, they're just really low probability, but would be really harmful if they occurred, that seems to inappropriately drop out. Because if you took a proper expected value type analysis, then of course that would be in there. So I think our framework is kind of going in the right direction to deal with that, but not all the way.
Questions from the floor, and give your Uber rating when you stand. And Mikhail, down the front here, Dana. Or do you want to call it out and I can repeat it? Go on. I've got a question here. Beg your pardon, Mikhail.
Dave Heatley, Uber rating 5.00. I just looked it up and I don't know why.
You don't have to give the rating.
My question relates to the zero price question. Both today and yesterday, people have assumed that the equilibrium price is a negative price and that it's rounded out to zero. But Do we actually have any evidence that the equilibrium price isn't a positive price that's then rounded out to zero?
We don't at all. So we actually don't know what the price is. I would say it's not so much an assumption that the equilibrium price is below zero. I think that the point that the Stigler report makes, and that Fiona Scott Morton, who was certainly the author of that part of the Stigler report, if not all of it, would make, is that we don't know, but it is not a sufficient argument for efficiency and social welfare from the platform that it has a zero price side. We shouldn't presume that everything is being done well and is welfare maximizing just because we see a zero price. That if we think about it more richly, the price might be negative. It might be higher, you're right, but it shouldn't be an automatic defense to anti-competitive harms or concerns about the platform that the price is zero. And I think that's where that argument about the negative price comes from.
Thoughts on that, James?
Yeah, I agree entirely. I think in two-sided markets, it's very difficult to predict what the equilibrium price will be, whether it's positive, negative, or zero. And it's more, at least the way I've been using it, is as a perhaps this is the case rather than an assumption.
Yeah.
Question on Commission's Mikhail.
The Commerce Commission 4.8. I guess I should let my wife use my Uber account more often. This is starting to sound a bit like an episode from Black Mirror, I think, or Social Credit. Anyway, I wanted to ask another question about merger control. And yesterday, one of the topics that came up in the discussion was behavioral undertakings.
Yes.
And so they're not available here in New Zealand. They're available in the US. And I wanted to just, so behavioral undertakings are a form of kind of voluntary self-regulation, and I just wanted to ask you whether you think they're uniquely desirable or undesirable in the context of these tech markets.
It's a terrific question. So certainly, the point was made, I think it was on your panel yesterday, that behavioral remedies that are to some extent monitorable and self-enforcing, are rare, but where those exist, they're fine. I think the big concern about a lot of behavioral remedies is they require, in the merger and acquisition framework, is they require ongoing oversight by a court, by the antitrust agency. And I think a lot of competition agencies, you have a unified competition consumer protection agency here. We nominally do in the US, in the FTC, but as Marina and I can both tell you, those two parts of the agency function very, very differently. It's not really an integrated, holistic sort of approach. So there's a lot of concern on among competition enforcers about having to keep oversight and to come back and police these behavioral restrictions. So they are disfavored. They're virtually never used in horizontal mergers. You really only see them in vertical mergers. And in vertical mergers, there's more of a logic for them, because if we think, as at least competition law has presumed, and as some of you heard me say in Wellington on Tuesday, probably presumed incorrectly, that there are presumptive efficiencies to vertical mergers. If we presume that, we don't want to get in the way of those efficiencies because of some little problem that we could resolve by a licensing requirement or some kind of supply agreement or some kind of conduct restriction. So we've been more tolerant of them there. I think we don't know how well they work. So as a general matter, I take the view that conduct restrictions are tough when they are done by a competition agency, and I much prefer structural solutions in the merger and acquisition context. It's one of the reasons I advocate that if we're going to use interoperability and interconnection, we think about having the proper regulatory agency there to decide what should be interconnected with and at what price, and to ensure that there's compliance.
James?
As well as the difficulties of ensuring compliance, I think there's an information asymmetry problem here between what Facebook and Google know about their businesses compared to what the regulator knows. So certainly if I was sitting in the regulator's shoes, I would be skeptical of any undertaking. I'd be worried that it falls into the sounds good but won't make much difference category.
Now we're going to squeak in one final question. We'll have to pay for it with a slightly shorter lunch, but I think that's good to go. Sorry. Question over here.
Thanks. George Ciolis, RBB Economics 4.83. Just on trying to tighten merger laws to capture rivals or potential rivals. Every horizontal merger that we deal with, and most mergers we deal with are horizontal mergers, deals with rivals. And it's a merger between firms that operate in the same market. So we shouldn't get, I think, too excited about trying to tighten laws to remove a merger between firms that are rivals. On Furman, which was a UK report, the CMA came out, I think, quite quickly after and rejected the balance of harms approach. I don't actually know why they did, but it seems to me that the balance of harms approach does place quite a high burden on the regulator, because it requires them not to assess whether harm is likely or not, but to try to actually quantify what that harm is. So it does, I think, make things quite hard for them. Thank you.
Two very quick reactions. I agree that we're always dealing with acquiring a rival when we're dealing with a horizontal merger, although I think that's why we have these somewhat stricter guidelines, and we have sort of a framework of market concentration thresholds amongst which, above which we won't allow that. I think the problem with a lot of these acquisitions that happen in the tech industry is they're not identified as horizontal. They're viewed as vertical or conglomerate with no overlap, so there's none of the typical policing or filters that come into a horizontal merger come in, and I think that's really been the problem. And then, I would just note that, well, I'll end on that and let James have the last word.
No further comment.
Well, thank you both. It is now lunch. We will come back to split sessions after lunch. If your session is on the right-hand side of the program, you're in that room. And can I urge you, if you're in this room, please come down to the front. There are lots of spaces at the tables. You don't need to hide at the back. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ralph.
That was great.
Yeah, really fun.
Thanks for preparing such good comments. That was excellent.